We've got the pleasure of having with us today, Brian Kropp. He is actually the Group Vice President and Chief of the HR practice over at Gartner. So thanks so much for being with us again, Brian. We are looking forward to your insights, maybe some of the data you can share with us that supports it. So we're going to start off with, we are winding down this year of 2020. Of course, the focus of that has been COVID. We know it has impacted employee productivity across many different sectors. Anything you can share about a sector or sectors where it's had more of an impact than others?
Yeah, there's obviously sectors that we can point to where it's had a really negative impact. So retail, hospitality, cruise lines, those sorts of things, it's been hugely tough for them. But when you look at other industries, not COVID, but the way that it's changed work has had some really interesting and long-term lasting implications for a lot of other industries and a lot of other sectors and jobs and roles from that perspective. So one of the things that I like to point to, which I think is absolutely fascinating, is since COVID hit, we've done the world's largest ever pilot experiment on changing the nature of work. Like we've literally had, a couple billion people across the planet working differently. And back when it started, we thought the big lesson and the big thing we were going to test is, are employees just as productive at working from home as they were in the office? And back then it's like, are they going to work hard, or are they going to sit at home on their couch and watch Netflix and eat pizza and take naps all day? Like, which of those two is going to happen? And what we found is that employees who work from home across the board are just as productive, if not more so, on average compared to employees that come to the workplace. So the question of where people work is effectively answered. Like if you can do your job remote, you can be just as productive doing your job remote. But there's something else that we've learned that's even way more interesting than that, which is, and it first started when we were talking to an insurance company that has a large call center, and they do a lot of claims processing, that sort of stuff. And they moved their employees remote, and they were tracking productivity, and they had all this new technology and software to track productivity. And what they found is that those employees were, one, just as productive, but what was more interesting and more nuanced is what they found is that some employees were more productive in the morning. Some employees were more productive in the afternoon. Some employees were more productive on Saturdays. Some employees were more productive on Thursdays. And what they've been able to do since then is not just shift where people work, but shift when people work. And what we've also found since then is that there's a lot of employees who would be more productive working 80% of the time for 80% of the pay. That there are some employees who can get an enormous amount of stuff done in 20 hours a week. And so what's going to be the more profound lesson that we take from COVID is not just, can people who work from home be as productive? Yes, abundantly clear, absolutely can. But a world that's much more radically flexible, where employees are working in different places, working at different times, working different amounts of hours, have different types of contract situations. But we're going from this world where there's 9 to 5 in an office, 5 days a week, to just getting stuff done whenever, wherever, however I need to get it done. And that shift in terms of this world that we're moving to, of radical flexibility, will be much more profound, much more longer lasting than the simple, in retrospect, naive question of can someone be productive if they're working from home?
That's a very, very insightful description of what's happened with productivity. You looked at it in those answers that you gave me, or those comments that you shared, really from a corporate standpoint, the productivity from a corporation standpoint. What about the employee or the person who is at home or at a different location than what have we learned from their attitude, if you can share anything around that?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I'll talk about it both as from kind of the perspective of employees, but also senior management in an organization, because when you put those two together, you get a really interesting way that it plays out. So when this first happened, the reaction of a lot of employees was, this is awesome, I get to work from home. Like, how wonderful is that? And the reaction from senior executives was, oh my God, this is terrible. Everybody's going to be working from home. But when you look at the employee perspective, since that moment, things have changed a lot. Like I said, they're just as productive, but they are also getting lonely. They're losing social connections. They're losing emotional ties to coworkers. And one of the things that we're able to do is track teams through time. And what you see is the teams that have had more turnover, the social engagement, the emotional attachment, those relationships are weaker than teams that have stuck together and have largely been cohesive through that time period. So the way that it's shifted for employees is like, isn't it great to be at home to, gosh, I'm getting tired, I'm feeling kind of lonely, I'm feeling burnt out from that perspective. And where employees are is they want the flexibility to be able to work from home sometimes, but they also want to be able to come into the workplace once, twice a week, a couple times a month, whatever it might be. So that's where employees are right now. Now, the journey of employers has been really different. For employers, it's been, oh my God, nobody's going to be working, to, hey, it's actually a lot cheaper if they work from home. And it's like, well, when people work from home, it's like, well, our electricity bills were lower, our cleaning bills were lower, like all those sorts of things. Now, a lot of companies have said, we can decrease the cost of our real estate footprint by, depending on the company, anywhere from 20 to 80%. And when you look at the total cost of real estate for a typical company, roughly speaking, it's about 20 to 30% of the cost of salary. So just to make the math easy, if an employee gets paid $100,000 a year, an average company is paying additional $20,000 to $30,000 per year for that employee for real estate costs, electricity, cleaning, everything else that's associated with that. So where kind of corporate leaders are is like, oh my gosh, nobody's going to work, to, hey, they're working, we could save a lot of money. And now where it's evolved, it's like, but they're not collaborating and innovating. And so where everyone is kind of getting to at the ends of the journey, both employees and the corporate leaders, is we actually want a hybrid world where we've got a smaller real estate footprint, where people can work from home some of the time, but they've got that radical flexibility to make it happen. But we've got some dedicated time and locations where we get people together to build those emotional and social connections and to create those collaborative and innovative moments that are there. And that's where we are now. But something that's really important to realize, what companies and employees have thought is like, well, we're going to take all the systems and processes that we've got and built and all the things that we've done, and we're just going to virtualize them. So like the way we used to collaborate is we'd get together in a conference room and we'd have a whiteboard and sticky notes, and we'd put sticky notes on a whiteboard and we would say we collaborated, like, ta-da. And we went through this period where it was like, you know what we're going to do? We're going to get a digital whiteboard with digital sticky notes and put our digital sticky notes on our digital whiteboard, and we're going to have collaborated. And it's been sucky. Like, it doesn't work. So rather than simply virtualizing the existing processes, what companies have to realize is you have to create a whole new way of doing things in a hybrid world, where some of your employees are there some of the time, some of your leaders are there some of the time, but no one is there all of the time. And you're going to have to reinvent yourself to create a much more collaborative digital environment where you build for digital first, rather than trying to virtualize your existing in-person processes.
That's a very fascinating. I like the hybrid approach, and it's going to be the more successful companies will figure out how to tweak that in which direction to optimize that. I'd like to go back to that team productivity comment that you made earlier, talking about the teams that are less productive are the ones that have, maybe less contact point, more lonely, things like that. What are some of the things you've seen successful companies do to sort of improve that feeling of team, that camaraderie, that bonding, so I don't feel like I'm out there on an island?
Yeah. Let me start with what not to do, because those are going to be a little bit more fun, right? One of the mistakes that we made at the start of the pandemic in retrospect was to say, oh gosh, we're worrying about losing our connections with our employees. So our solution is going to be more Zoom check-ins.
Oh yeah.
Right. And essentially what that turned into from an employee perspective is, why is my manager bothering me all the time and micromanaging me? Now, that wasn't because managers were bad people or companies had bad intentions. It's that we just didn't know any better. Right? We shouldn't know. Um, and the reason why I start there is because what a lot of people think is that the way to be successful in a more digital virtual environment is more activity. And what we find is more activity is more exhausting and less productive. So there's a couple of things that really smart companies are doing here. One, what they've realized is that work itself is inherently social activity. And this might be disheartening as I work through it, but 24 hours a day, only so many hours in a week. And once you take out the amount of time you spend sleeping, and it should be a lot more than the average person sleeps. But once you take that out, essentially half of your waking time is spent at work or doing work, if not more. And one of the things that a lot of people get about where they work is the very social connections that are there. Like that's where a lot of your friends are. That's where you talk about how your sports team did over the weekend. That's where you talk about what your kids are up to. That's where you talk about the vacation you just went on. But it's very social from that perspective. And so one of the things that you have to do to be really successful going forward is figure out how do you build a social, emotionally connected organization, not just a rationally connected organization. And at some level, some of that stuff starts to get really silly feeling and a little cheesy feeling, but it's hugely valuable. So there's one company that we work with, a French company. And what they actually do is they created a radio station that all of their employees can listen to and stream while they're working. And what you're able to do is give dedications to people on the radio station for people that have helped you out on stuff, or just to like say, hey, I know you've got this thing coming the weekend, like good luck for it, or whatever it might be. And when I first heard about it, I was kind of like, that seems super weird. And then I thought about it for a second. I was like, but you can see how that actually builds friendships and how that helps build relationships. So what we're going to have to think about going forward, and this is one of the ways where we have to start with a hybrid first mindset, is how do we make sure that our organization is socially connected and emotionally connected, not just rationally connected. And that in so many ways is the key to making this successful. And that's really what you want to be building towards. And any activity that you're engaging in, you're going to try to figure out some sort of ROI analysis or whatever associated with it. One of the biggest components is like, is this going to help our people feel closer to each other in a more connected way or not? And if the answer to that is yes, then it's probably worth thinking about more and perhaps doing. If the answer to that's no, you can probably stop thinking about that idea and move on to the next one right off the bat in terms of building that culture, that connection, those emotions to make that work.
So as we get there, we were joking about the manager who is very intrusive with the number of Zooms during a day. We're talking about people trying to connect. When or where does that line get drawn, or is it just gray between me, my own time, my privacy, and what's happening from a corporate perspective in my life and as part of my life, I guess?
Yeah. Let me start with why it's a good idea to push that line and to try to get more involved. When we've analyzed companies and we look at a series of outcomes that are associated with those employees, so they're not work outcomes, but life outcomes. So if you think about their financial health, their mental health, how much they sleep at night, different things like that. What we find is that on average, employers who get more involved in their employees' personal lives and track more of those sorts of things in what may feel a very intrusive way, those employees on average score higher on the self-reported metrics by 8 to 20%, depending upon what you're looking at. So when your employer gets more involved in these things, your employees are actually better off. Now, there's also a separate question, which is where is the line in terms of, and this is kind of what you're getting to, of like, what's okay and what's creepy.
That's right.
And that line has been shifting to more into what we used to thought was the creepy space and where we're getting increasingly comfortable with. So a couple of years ago, there's some companies that we learned about that had microchipped their employees, like literally like putting a microchip in your employee.
So they actually did that.
Yeah, they did that. There's 6 companies we know that have microchipped at least some of their employees.
That's going to be a whole different webinar and whole different interview series.
Yeah, but boy, that kind of falls into the creepy category, right? You're like, it might be a little intrusive, like putting technology in my body to see where I am. Right? It's like a little bit more than like, what time did they show up to work today? Sorts of things. So you see that really at the bleeding edge of what's going on. But since the start of the pandemic, about a third of companies for the first time bought some sort of one of these new monitoring tracking devices. And this runs the range from everything that tracks how long you've been typing and can give you nudges to say you should stand up and move around, to stuff that can take pictures of you as you're working and then apply algorithms to your facial expressions to see if you're getting stressed or not, to technologies where your manager can just look into your camera without you having to accept anything. That all, if I had told you about that a year or 2 years ago, you'd be like, super creepy, super intrusive.
Correct.
A third of companies have bought something like that and are actively using it with their employees since the start of the pandemic. You go all the way back before this. And 2020 will be the year where more companies are using some sort of thing like that than a large scale employee survey to understand their workforce. So we're worried about kind of this creepy cool line, but the reality is we've already crossed it. More companies are using that to understand their workforce than a large scale employee survey. And 2020 is the year when that happened. And that's occurred for a variety of reasons. One, by moving remote, we needed to come up with new ways to understand our employees in terms of what's going on with that perspective. 2, we have 100% accepted it in our private lives. Large social media companies, online retailers, all those sorts of things, they have thousands of data points about all of us in our private lives. Like, they know who we voted for. They know who we were going to vote for before we even decided who we were going to vote for. And we have become almost 100% accepting of all of that because we see the value and benefit of a lot of it. Like, it's awesome to go to the place that I just bought something from online and they're suggesting the next thing I should buy. I'm like, hey, I actually do need that. That is a real service that's provided. It's really valuable. It gives me a way to connect with people. So we've totally accepted it. And we're increasingly accepting things in the workplace that are monitoring and tracking us because we accept it in our private lives, but we're also starting to see the value and benefit from it, right? So, and it's not fully there yet, but it's getting there. So like, you can get an email in the morning from whatever technology system you're using saying, hey, I've scanned through your email and here are some things you might need to follow up on today. And a lot of times, like, I already did that, but every once in a while, you're like, oh yeah, I do need to do that, right? So we're starting to see the value and benefit of these sorts of things. And from that perspective, we have crossed the creepy cool line, and we are into what we thought was creepy 4 or 5 years ago, and that is our day-to-day increasingly. And the reason why it works is because we've gone from tracking and monitoring to using that data information to actually help. So back to the example we were talking about, if we don't have that monitoring software to understand when employees are more productive in the day, we never could have answered that question. We never could have provided guidance to employees to say like, hey, you could actually just get as much stuff done if you actually start working earlier in the day, and you could do your 40 hours worth of work in 30, and we're still going to pay you the same, and you get 10 free hours back. 10 free hours a week, if that is the value of being tracked, the vast majority of people make that trade-off, every chance they get. So we're already there. Now, in order for it to work, you have to be transparent with employees that you're doing this. You have to show them the value of it. You have to explain to them why their job is changing because of this. But a couple of years ago, when I first started talking about some of these things, you'd look at people and you talk to them and it was like, oh my God, this is like the baddest sci-fi movie ever.
Big Brother is right around the corner.
And you hear audible gasps from people
Yeah.
a couple of years ago when you talk about it. And now what you hear is like, yeah, I can see how it'd be helpful. And that's just where we are. And we probably weren't going to get there until 2025, but COVID accelerated all of that. And where we're going to be in 2025 is where we are now. We're going to get there eventually. We just got to the future faster. That's really
interesting. So we just got done talking about Big Brother technology. We talked earlier about, everybody's over inundated with Zoom. We've tried to replicate some of the processes with sticky notes on the wall. Any other cool tech that you've come across or seen coming out of the gate now, maybe accelerated again, like you said, wasn't going to come around until 2025. And now because of 2020, there's actually a market for this.
Yeah. I think the markets that are going to be the most interesting from an HR tech perspective is whoever can effectively figure out digital and online collaboration. And nobody's got a good answer to that, really.
Yep.
At this point. It's
nothing I've seen, put it that way.
Yeah, it's getting better, but it's not there. And until that occurs, there is still going to be enormous value just from a number of widgets per hour sort of productivity measure, getting people together in person. But that's a huge place where there's an opportunity. I think a second place where there's an opportunity is we spend a lot of time thinking about employee productivity for the employee and tracking the employee and their performance and what they're doing and what they're engaging in. What we forget about, though, is employees or support for the managers of our employees from a digital perspective. And I'll point out a couple of things that are really interesting. One, if you go back to the mid-2000s until where we are now, the average manager span of control has more than doubled. So the average manager has more than twice as many direct reports now as they did compared to 12, 15 years ago. Two, and this is a dirty little secret that most people don't like to talk about, most managers have no idea what their employees are actually doing or working on. And in a digital remote world, that's only truer. So you look at all of that. And then you look at some of the data that we found coming out of what's been going on with COVID. And even before, we went back and looked at this again. What we find is that managers are not good right now, not consistently good right now at managing remote employees. And they've got more of them to manage. Like, here's just a really fascinating data point for you. Remote employees and people who are working from home and people that are working from the workplace are just as productive on average. However, people who are working remote are told twice as often by their manager that they've done something wrong and something bad compared to people that are in the office place, working from the office place.
Fascinating.
People who are in the office place are told twice as often that they've done something good compared to people who are working remote, even though their performance is effectively the exact same. So managers just are not experienced on average in terms of managing employees who are working remote. So that's a really simple way where you could use technology to track the feedback that you're giving to employees who are working from home versus employees who are working from the workplace. And is the feedback that you're providing as a manager accurate to the contributions that people are making or not? Or are you biased against your remote employees? Because most managers are biased against remote employees, even though they have, on average, the same performance contribution as those in the office. You go through and list like a bunch of other things like that, but so much of our support has been, well, how do we help employees perform? How do we help our managers change when we're going to have fewer of them? They're going to be managing more people in much more diverse situations, not just diversity of those people that we're managing, but their work environment will be more diverse, the hybrid conversation. How do we support those managers who are going to have a much more emotional and social job rather than a rational job? Because one of the things that's going to be different about managers is historically, the way that a manager got their power and authority was largely because I said so, which is also a great parenting technique, as a side note, as I've learned through the years. Sarcastic voice from that perspective. But you can't rely on because I did it, because I've got experience on it, because I said so anymore. And how do you support managers when they've got more direct reports, they don't see them as often, they don't have the best instincts on average, they can't rely on power and authority to manage and motivate people, they have to do it in a fundamentally different way. How do you make that work? And what sort of technology can you apply to get managers performing more productively when everything about what being a manager is shifting and changing as well?
That's fascinating about the bias
Mhm.
against the remote worker. As you were telling and excuse me, describing that, I'm thinking it's much harder, excuse me. Good thing we're doing video editing, huh? I'm thinking it's much harder to deliver that negative conversation face to face, right? And I thought
Yeah.
that's how it was going, but it's very interesting. So,
I'll add one other thing onto that that's pretty
yeah,
interesting as well, is which is a huge risk of this new remote hybrid world. So you take that fact that managers on average are biased towards people that come into the workplace. That also plays out when they're thinking about comp decisions and
of course.
promotion decisions, right? So as much as I hate to admit it, people that come into the workplace are career advantage versus those who work from home. Totally unfair, but true. Let me layer in one other additional thing for you. We've been looking at the profile of employee that would rather continue to work remote or work hybrid versus those who would prefer to work in the office place. And what we find is that men on average would prefer to work in the office place relative to women who on average would prefer to work remote hybrid. Put those two facts together, that you're biased towards in-office employees, men are more likely to be in-office employees than women, even though all the data shows they can perform at the exact same levels. Think about the gender discrimination that's
Just
going
going
to
to accentuate what's already there from the beginning.
For sure. Like, we have a gender wage gap. We can debate all day long how big or small it is, but it exists, right? If we aren't really thoughtful about how this plays out, that gap will get worse and get bigger if we aren't really thoughtful about how do we manage the hybrid experience. And that's just men versus women that I was talking about and that comparison. But all of the different ways that inequity could occur in a very different world that we're all living and existing in. Another place where technology can really help us is how are we managing equity and fairness in a world that is much more remote and virtual, where there's all of those biases that unfairly exist, that we could try to say, well, we're just going to get our managers to be better, but that's a fool's errand. How can we use technology to create a fairer, more equitable organization is another place where I think there's a lot of interesting opportunity that we could focus on and do some cool stuff with.
I really believe that machine learning can start to level that playing field, you know, whether it be gender, whether it be remote versus on-site, that kind of thing. I think you're right. So as we're talking about engaging these people, the hybrid approach, one of the big things at Rallyware that we're always about is how can we positively affect performance, right? Get people to be successful in whatever they want to do in life. What about motivation? Not so much motivation. Let's talk a little bit about incentives and recognition. How does that change in this new hybrid environment that you and I are discussing?
Yeah, I mentioned the recognition feedback question, just about how that's really problematic in a remote world. A couple of other things that I think are going to be really important. One, as we think about kind of the shifting nature of what it means to be a manager, more people, those sorts of things, one of the long-term implications that's associated with that is the average number of managers in a company as a ratio in terms of percent of total employees is going to go down. The average company is going to have fewer managers per 100 people, whatever measure you want to use. Just a question of how much. We've already seen it. It's going to continue on that trend. That creates a bunch of interesting questions. One question is, how do I build career paths from a comp and recognition perspective for those employees that make huge contributions that aren't managers? Because if the path forward to having a successful career is less likely to be through managers and becoming a manager than manager of managers, how do you reward and drive the success of more people who are more in what historically would have called individual contributor roles? Right?
Correct.
That creates a whole set of interesting comp, career progression, reward progression sorts of questions that are out there. That's a really big one that is fundamentally different, that we're not spending enough time thinking about. What does a career look like if it's not being a manager? That I think we need to unpack and look at.
So that leads us sort of to an obvious next point, talking about taking a look at my talent within the corporation and upskilling, reskilling, that kind of thing. So that, I mean, I've seen the facts and figures about what it takes to get rid of an employee and try to find someone for that next job up the path, right? So does this change? Because, I mean, this is what we were talking about, right? Career paths are going to be different in this hybrid environment. What about retooling those folks or giving them those options and trying to let them go up that ladder, right?
Yeah. I'll share with you something that's really interesting on this front. So we download every job description that's posted on the internet. And we've been doing that for 5-6 years now, something like that. And there's a lot of job descriptions that are posted on the internet as a side note. And there's something really interesting when you start to examine those job descriptions. So you take a job, and back in 2017, the average job description had a bit over 12 skills that a company was looking for.
Okay.
Which probably then was a lot. Okay? Then you look at those 12, and you look today, how many of those 12 are companies still asking for? Right? It varies when you look at job, function level, those sorts of things. But on average, it's gone from about 12, the 12 that were there, it's down to about 7 of those 12 have stuck around on average. So one way to think about that is almost half the skills that were in demand in 2017 are no longer in demand. Something else is going on as well, though. If you look at what is on a job posting now in terms of the skills that a company is looking for that have been added, there is, on average, again, when you look at 2020, about 11 new skills that have been added that were not on a job posting in 2017. So you put all that together. In 2017, on average, we were looking at about 12 skills per candidate, per job. 2020, about 18. And 11 of those 18 were not on a job posting in 2017. We're looking for more skills, and they're changing at a faster rate. The half-life of a skill is just getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And so you're confronted with a choice as a company, which is, are we going to hire a bunch of people and fire them when their skills are obsolete? Because that's really expensive, both on the hiring and firing part of it. And by the way, there's not a lot of people that want to work at an organization which is like, so you've been here a year and a half, you've done a lot, your skills obsolete, bye-bye, right? Like, not perhaps the most engaging organization to work for. You can rent those skills, right? And just go out on the labor market, contract them, sorts of stuff. The problem with all of that is it tends to be expensive. And if work is more collaborative, more social, all those sorts of things, which we believe it will, you don't have the same connections with people from that perspective. Sometimes it makes sense to do that, but you don't build long-term bonds. You don't build those emotional connections that keep people together, that build longer relationships, that help people understand how to work with each other. So what it gets you is, if skills are changing faster than ever, and it's important from a culture perspective and from a cost perspective to keep people together, and they learn more about not just the skill sets, but who we are and how we can work together, all those sorts of things. What it means is you have to get dramatically faster at upskilling people. Now, we've seen that occur if you look at companies like AT&T, Amazon, a variety of others, who are big, huge companies that can write a check for $1 billion and say, we're going to spend $1 billion+ to make this happen. That is great. And it's wonderful that those companies are doing that. And they should receive a ton of credit for that willingness to invest in their workforce. There's not a lot of companies that can write $1 billion check to upskill their workforce. So what we're going to have to think through is, how do we dramatically speed our ability to upskill our workforce via technology, rotations, tours of duty, all sorts of other ways to help our employees upskill faster? Because again, 12 skills to 18, roughly 2/3 of those that we're looking for today, we didn't even know about in 2017. Solving that problem is a worthy problem to solve, and we're going to need to do it in order to make sure our workforce can adjust at the speed of our business, because right now our workforces on average are not adjusting at the speed of our businesses.
So I'm going to take you, so we took that upskilling, reskilling. I love the comment on the half-life of a position or a job description, right? That's an amazing, it doesn't surprise me, but to hear it said, it's like, oh, that even makes it more critical.
And seeing the data about how it's actually playing out.
Let me take you back to the rent-a-skill comment, right? So to me, as soon as you said that, it's all about, we hear this all the time, gig economy, right? I'm going to gig my life together so I can do. So from a worker's perspective, that might be attractive in some cases. From a corporate perspective, from, you know, cost cutting, that kind of thing, I know it doesn't build that bonding. What have you seen from corporations with that rent-a-skill, gigging, those temporary worker type things?
Yeah, you know, there's a group of companies whose business model is gig contract.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, everybody goes like Uber, Lyft,
Yep,
those sorts of places. And there's those, but there's also a lot of other companies. So a company like H&R Block, for example, they hire thousands of accountants during tax season on a gig contract basis to run their company. And that is a gig model that they've got. And there's other companies like that. But let's take those companies and put them aside, because there's
right.
Not that many, in all honesty. As excited as we are about that, there are not that many. And by the way, a lot of them don't make money. So, you know, the whole issue of like being profitable at some point actually kind of matters. And most gig companies are not there yet. So then you look at kind of the rest of the universe of companies that are out there. And what you find is that they're willing to engage in the market under a couple of situations. One, if they know they just have a particular skill set that they're looking for a short period of time, then they're willing to engage in the labor market and the gig economy that way. Two, we saw a lot of companies during the pandemic and the worst parts of it economically, and then coming out, we're still seeing this today. Companies saying, we're not sure, is it going to be a double dip recession?
Yep.
W, like what is it going to be a V, like all those sorts of things. That CFOs saying we're not willing to commit to long-term hiring because we don't know what the future is going to look like. So they're willing to engage in a contract environment like that. You see that a lot in Europe as well, where the cost of hiring an employer are the same, but you commit to a longer term contract, and it is harder to manage workforce costs in Europe than in the US. So you see an even greater hesitancy there. So we saw about a third of companies when we surveyed their CFOs saying, our talent strategy across the next couple of quarters is going to be contract, gig, temporary, until we have more certainty about the labor market. But when we do, we're going to want to have full-time employment. And if I were to go to Las Vegas and someone were to bet me, are we all going to be working in a contract gig world? With the exception of those companies whose business model is that way, I would short that bet. I believe that the talk about how we're all going to be gig contract is not real. There's going to be lots of situations where it occurs. There's going to be times when it makes sense, particular skills, economic uncertainty, fast growing company that can't hire fast enough, temporary projects, those will be there. But a lot of employees want full-time employment. And the reason why they've opted for a contract gig environment is either they can't find it or they like the flexibility that's associated with that contract gig environment. And one of the biggest lessons from COVID is that as an employer, we can offer that flexibility to our employees and still have a full-time relationship with them. So for example, there's some companies that we've talked to that are saying, gosh, what we've learned about our employees is that there's a big chunk of our employees that want 80% of the pay for 80% of the time. And they prefer that to 100% of the pay for 100% of the time. So we've come up with all these sorts of ways to be more flexible. And so the people that are in the gig contract market, because they want flexibility, they can now get that and will increasingly be able to get that from their employer. So wouldn't you rather have a full-time relationship that's highly flexible than a gig environment that has that uncertainty? That seems pretty clear where most people will pick. Two, from an employer perspective and kind of a finance perspective, and a senior leader perspective, it's increasingly less about the unique technical skills that you bring, because those have such a short half-life. And given that work is more collaborative, it's more about learning about the people that you work with, building that culture with the people that you've got. So you develop a shorthand, you develop a way to communicate, you develop ways to collaborate that are based upon those personal relationships. And the way to make those personal relationships grow and blossom and be successful is to do it a bunch of times. And if you've got a contract gig environment, you're not getting the repetition of the personal interactions that build that long-term productivity. And so when you look at it from a collaboration innovation perspective, you don't want to rent people all the time to come in and do that. You want people that know you, trust you, understand your product, understand where you're going, know each other, can work together to drive that innovation. So that's where I think the contract gig environment will be important, will play a critical role. We're not going to all be working in a contract gig environment. And by the way, the last note on this one is that what a lot of companies are doing are taking some of those principles and putting them internally. So employees can do a rotation where they can work on a different project within their own company and get that experience without actually having to leave their company. And so the principles are being embedded with companies, but the economic model, much less so. And separating the principles from the economic model is where we're going to head. So that's why, I would short it.
I appreciate those comments. And just as you were talking about collaboration and innovation, making that so valuable when I'm around all the time, it's just that continuous thread of historical knowledge too. Sometimes that is just invaluable, not for things we are doing them the way we're not going to do it this way because I can tell you why.
Yeah, I remember that, and it failed miserably. Again.
It sounded great when we first talked about it, right? So as you were talking there, and we sent you, comments, notes, whatever, I really wasn't going to get to the thing of comparing 2008 and 2020. And when you started talking V's and W's and trying to predict what's going to happen so that I know how to, now all of a sudden, that becomes a conversation that automatically comes out of some of the things you've already shared. So any similarities that you've seen to, what I call the last worst dip to what we've experienced in 2020?
Yeah, similarities and differences. When you go back to the global financial crisis, that was a financial crisis that created a humanitarian crisis, right? People lost their jobs, people lost their homes because of financial malfeasance in a lot of cases, irresponsibility in a lot of cases, but it was a financial crisis at its core. And what we saw when that happened, the reaction of the workforce and organizations was, in retrospect, very inwardly focused. So what a lot of companies did at that point was lay off people, make redundancies, save costs, whatever happens to them, happens to them. COVID is a humanitarian crisis that's creating a financial crisis. And the response has been, for the most part, much more humanitarian than financially driven. So we saw a lot of companies decide to furlough their workforce rather than lay them off. We saw a lot of companies partner with their talent competitors that were actually hiring to get people to move from one company to another company.
Interesting.
We've seen companies get much more involved in the personal lives of their employees by offering them support. There's companies that provided all sorts of learning opportunities to kids that were stuck at home because they weren't getting it through their school system. Novartis has done a really cool thing where they have a really robust internal L&D platform.
Mhm.
And they opened up that L&D platform to the family members and spouses of their employees to say, I know you don't work here, but your wife does. You can take advantage of all the learning that we provide to help them upskill.
Outstanding.
So we've seen this humanitarian response to solve that humanitarian problem first, the financial problem second, whereas before it was solve the financial problem first, and maybe worry about the humanitarian problem second. And because of that, we've seen fundamentally different responses. Back in the global financial crisis, what we actually saw is employee engagement levels fall. We saw discretionary effort fall. We saw 1 in 4 high potential employees quit their employer because they made them do more and didn't give them rewards for it, and didn't promote them for it coming out the back end of it. So we had a financial problem. We responded to it as a finance question, and we damaged our employees for the most part. Here,
I hope that we continue to remember some of these humanitarian efforts and attitudes that we have from this. If we do that, there will be a lot of good that comes out of this.
yeah, 100%, because we've confronted with a humanitarian problem, and the majority of companies have responded in a humane way. Now, like they had to cut costs, they had to lay people off. Yes. But you look at like 08, 09, where it was lay people off, but keep paying senior executives.
Mhm.
Here it is, yeah, we still have to lay some people off and do that, but cut salaries of senior executives, continue to provide support, do all these sorts of things. On net, it's been much more humane. And while COVID is horrible, it is terrible. One of the silver linings, hopefully to your point, Rich, is that we've had a chance to look inside the lives of our employees, the homes of our employees. Like we've had people's kids walk in on video calls. We've seen their cat walk across the street. Like, you know, like we've had to give our employees time to homeschool and do their job. And hopefully we realize, and there's a CFO that I was talking to who, like the curmudgeonist guy that you can imagine, like if Disney was like, we need to cast a CFO, it's like that guy, you know? It's like, he's going to be our villain in this movie. It's like that guy. And I remember talking to him and he goes, Brian, I've realized something about COVID. And he's super smart. So I was like, what it is? And I thought it was going to be some fancy thing about balance sheets and all that stuff. And he goes, I realized something. I'm like, what? Our employees are actually human beings. And part of me is like, yeah. But another part of me is like, that's actually an incredibly profound realization that we don't have workers, we don't have employees, we have human beings that happen to be working for us. And if we treat them like human beings, and if our goal is to improve their life experience, where work happens to be part of their life, rather than improve their employee experience and treat life as a separate construct that we try to balance or integrate or whatever. But if we say, let's improve your life experience and make your life better and work as part of your life, you as an employee and a human being are going to be better off. But what we also find with the data is that you as an employer are going to be rewarded with higher performing employees who are less likely to quit, who are more innovative, who say better things about you on the labor market. And you as an employer are better off if you adopt this really basic realization, which we don't have workers, we don't have employees, we have human beings that we happen to work with. And if that is what we take away from COVID, 2020 is terrible, and there's all sorts of pain and horrible things that occurred during it and will continue to occur into 2021. But if we take that out for the long term, I think the world's going to be not just a little bit better off, but hopefully a lot bit better off. And that perhaps is a really positive silver lining from all of the pain and frustration and all of the badness that has occurred across the last 12 months across the globe.
So I think that even before 2020, I would have heard you talking about collaboration, innovation, caring about your employee will produce a stronger company. Now, all of a sudden, because of this, you actually have the majority of people listening and nodding in assent, where before you had to make a case and build a case and hope that you could get a couple individuals to listen to that.
It's gone from should we do that to how do we do that?
It is. So speaking of how we do this, because I want to be respectful of your time, I really, really appreciate you participating today. We have talked about all kinds of things that if I were an HR leader, I would go, okay, which piece do I move in? It's like that old 15 or 16 piece puzzle. How do I get 1 through 15 in a row, right? So besides everything we've covered today in the landscape, biggest changes for HR leaders besides figuring out how to fine tune that hybrid model?
Yeah, I think if I was a head of HR right now, the question I would be asking about everything that we're doing is, does this create a fairer, more equitable organization? When you look at, and you kind of roll the clock ahead the next couple of years and you think like a year from now, where are we going to be? COVID-19 is largely going to be in our rearview mirror. The economy will probably be doing okay, but inequality is probably going to get worse within our company, within society. And are we building a fairer, more equitable organization? You kind of talked a little bit about the risks on gender equity and gender fairness and the gender wage gap that can potentially occur and get worse going forward. But there's all sorts of things. Are we treating remote employees fairly compared to non-remote employees? Thinking about people in corporate environments versus non-corporate environments. Thinking about employees that were really negatively impacted by COVID versus those who weren't. If you think about one of the other things that's really interesting is that the performance between successful organizations and less successful organizations has gotten greater, but CEO pay at almost every organization looks like that CEO is the head of a highly successful organization. And I think the biggest question going forward is how do we create a more equitable, fair organization, which I think is one of the reasons why the smartest, most progressive leaders that we talk to don't just talk about it as diversity and inclusion anymore, which is absolutely critically important, but they talk about it as diversity, equity, and inclusion. And are we creating a diverse company and a diverse workforce and respecting the diversity of our employees? Are we creating an inclusive organization where we're able to bring all these people together? And are we treating them fairly to get the most out of them, to get the most productivity, most collaboration, most innovation, most everything out of them? And I think that's going to be one of the things that will be the biggest challenge going forward across the next couple of years is how to create this equitable, fair organization, which, by the way, doesn't mean fair outcomes. Different people are going to get different things. People are going to get promoted. People are going to get paid more, and they should. 100% they should. We should have a differentiation. But was the process fair to get you there? Was the treatment fair of everyone? Did everyone have the same access to opportunity or not? And that sense of fairness and equity is going to become a big issue that HR is going to have to start tackling going forward.
Wonderful comments, outstanding insights. Brian Kropp of Gartner, he's the group vice president and chief of the HR research group over there, has shared all kinds of interesting data with us today. Brian, thank you again for your time. I could have listened to you for hours, but in respect to your time, I know you've got many other things on your plate. Thanks again for all of your insights and comments that you've shared with us this afternoon.
Great. Thanks for having me. Talk to you soon.
All right. Take care, sir.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.